Donald Trump's influence on American politics has been undeniable since his initial rise to power in 2016. His time in office was marked by a slew of controversial actions, executive orders, and unprecedented challenges to the norms of American democracy. One of the central themes of his post-presidential career has been his vocal critique of the electoral process, particularly following his defeat in the 2020 election. While many of his ideas on election reform have been speculative and extreme, recent comments made during his speech have revealed a more concrete vision for the future of U.S. elections. Trump's proposed changes are not only concerning for the health of American democracy, but also represent a significant shift in Republican Party strategy, a strategy that could backfire on them in ways they have not fully considered. In this video, we will explore Trump's latest statements on election reform, the implications of those ideas, and how they could fundamentally alter the way American elections are conducted. Additionally, we will examine the broader political context surrounding these proposals and why they represent a major challenge to the principles of democracy in the United States. Finally, we'll break down why these proposals may not be as easily enacted as Trump would hope and why, in the end, they could hurt the Republican Party more than they help. Recently, Donald Trump received the Patriot of the Year award from Fox News, an honor that he accepted with his usual bravado. However, during his acceptance speech, something caught the attention of many political analysts and commentators. Trump began discussing a vision for changing the U.S. electoral system. What followed was a tirade that seemed out of place, especially considering the context of the event, but it provided some crucial insights into his plans for the future. Trump's vision includes several key elements. Paper ballots. Trump has long been critical of voting technology, particularly electronic voting machines, which have been the subject of conspiracy theories among his base. He's called for a return to paper ballots, claiming that this would eliminate fraud and make elections more secure. The reality, however, is that paper ballots are already widely used in U.S. elections. In fact, over 98% of counties in the country already use paper ballots in some form. The push for paper ballots is less about security and more about stoking fears around electronic voting, fears that have been repeatedly debunked by experts. Voter ID and proof of citizenship. Trump has also reiterated his call for mandatory voter ID and proof of citizenship for all voters. While voter ID laws are already in place in 35 states, the idea of requiring proof of citizenship is a more extreme measure that would likely disenfranchise a significant portion of the population, particularly immigrants and people from marginalized communities. The problem with voter ID laws, as critics argue, is that they impose barriers to voting for people who are less likely to have the required identification, especially those from lower-income backgrounds, elderly voters, and young people. The costs associated with obtaining an ID, as well as the time and effort required to secure one, can create significant obstacles, undermining the very principle that voting should be a right, not a privilege. Eliminating mail-in voting. Trump has repeatedly stated that he wants to eliminate mail-in voting and early voting, arguing that these methods lead to fraud and undermine the integrity of elections. However, the reality is that mail-in voting is widely used across the country, with millions of Americans relying on it for convenience, accessibility, and health reasons. This includes a significant portion of elderly voters, many of whom are traditionally Republican. By seeking to eliminate mail-in voting, Trump risks disenfranchising these voters, potentially alienating an important base of support for the GOP. Same-day voting. Trump has also suggested that voting should be restricted to a single day, advocating for same-day voting. This proposal overlooks the practical challenges that many voters face, particularly those in rural areas, working-class citizens, and people with disabilities. By limiting voting to a single day, the proposal risks disenfranchising those who cannot afford to take time off work, those without access to polling stations, or those who need assistance to cast their ballots. The shift to same-day voting could also place an immense strain on the logistics of elections, creating longer wait times and potential errors in the voting process. The flaws and backlash. How Trump's plan could backfire. While Trump's proposals might sound appealing to certain segments of the American electorate, particularly those who are prone to conspiracy theories about election integrity, they are fundamentally flawed and could have severe consequences for the Republican Party. The biggest problem with Trump's plan is that it fails to take into account the diverse needs of the American electorate and the realities of how people vote. Elderly voters and mail-in voting. One of the most significant groups of voters who rely on mail-in voting and early voting are the elderly. These voters tend to vote Republican, particularly in swing states like Florida. Eliminating these voting methods would disproportionately affect older voters, potentially disenfranchising hundreds of thousands of Republican-leaning individuals. In other words, Trump's push to eliminate mail-in voting could hurt the very group that the GOP relies on most in many states. States' rights, a double-edged sword. Another major flaw in Trump's plan is the constitutional reality that elections are largely governed by state law, not federal law. While Trump might push for nationwide changes, the power to determine how elections are run rests with individual states. This states' rights issue is particularly important to Republicans, who often champion local control and oppose federal overreach. By seeking to impose a uniform federal standard for elections, Trump could clash with state governors, especially in swing states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona, who are responsible for election administration. This could lead to legal battles that end up in the courts, potentially stalling or blocking Trump's proposals entirely. The voter ID issue, a barrier to voting. While voter ID laws might seem like a reasonable way to prevent fraud, they often create unnecessary barriers for those who are least likely to have IDs, disproportionately affecting low-income people, people of color, and young voters. These are groups that are more likely to vote Democratic. By pushing for stricter voter ID laws, Trump could inadvertently suppress votes that would benefit his political opponents. The argument that IDs are necessary for basic life activities, like flying, misses the point. Many of the people who are disenfranchised by these laws are not frequent travelers or people with the means to maintain government-issued identification. The issue of access, transportation, and affordability. Access to voting is a central issue in Trump's proposals. Many of his suggestions, such as requiring proof of citizenship or eliminating mail-in voting, assume that all citizens have the means to comply with such requirements. However, millions of Americans lack access to reliable transportation, and many live in rural areas where polling stations are far away. Forcing people to travel long distances or pay for IDs could disproportionately affect low-income Americans, making it harder for them to exercise their right to vote. The constitutional and legal challenges ahead. While Trump's rhetoric about election reform may be alarming, it is important to remember that the U.S. Constitution places strict limits on what can be done with respect to elections. The Constitution gives states the power to regulate how elections are run, which means that any attempt to impose nationwide reforms will be met with legal challenges. As we've seen with previous efforts to overhaul election laws, the courts have consistently ruled in favor of states' rights, and Trump's proposals are unlikely to change that. Additionally, there are several federal laws in place designed to protect voters' rights, including the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibits discrimination in voting. If Trump's proposed changes were to pass, they would likely face immediate legal challenges from civil rights groups, Democratic states, and other organizations committed to ensuring that all Americans have equal access to the ballot box. These legal battles could drag on for years, potentially blocking any attempts at sweeping changes to the electoral process. Donald Trump's recent comments about changing U.S. elections reflect a dangerous and undemocratic vision for the future of American democracy. While his proposals, such as eliminating mail-in voting, mandating voter ID, and pushing for paper ballots, may seem like common-sense reforms to some, they threaten to disenfranchise millions of Americans and create unnecessary barriers to voting. Furthermore, Trump's push for federal intervention in state-run elections could run afoul of the Constitution, sparking legal battles that could tie up any meaningful changes for years to come. In the end, Trump's efforts to reshape the electoral process could backfire on the Republican Party, especially as it risks alienating key groups of voters, such as the elderly and those from marginalized communities. His vision for a fairer election system might sound appealing to his base, but it is ultimately one that would undermine the very principles of democracy that America was founded on. While Trump's influence on the Republican Party is undeniable, his ability to fundamentally alter the way American elections are conducted remains in doubt, especially given the legal and political challenges that lie ahead. As we move closer to the 2024 election and beyond, it is crucial that Americans remain vigilant in protecting the integrity of their electoral process, ensuring that every eligible voter has the opportunity to participate.